My wife picked me up at the airport after 3 weeks. But she was distant. I looked at her and said, "Did you miss me?" She smiled faintly, but her eyes darted away, fixed on something invisible behind me. It was a simple moment, ordinary. To anyone passing by, a husband returning from a work trip, a wife waiting with her hands tucked in her coat pockets. But under the surface, beneath the smiles, under the polite greetings, a storm was already raging. On the flight home, James had rehearsed this reunion a dozen times in his mind. He had imagined her running into his arms, imagined the familiar scent of her perfume, imagined the way her laughter would fill the silence that had weighed on him all the way back from Patagonia. But now, standing in the crowded Portland International Airport, with people swirling around them, the truth pierced through his fantasies like an icicle. Something was wrong. 3 weeks ago, James had boarded a plane to Argentina for a groundbreaking environmental project. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, working with an elite international team, studying glacier erosion in the Torres del Paine National Park. For James, an environmental scientist who had chased grants and papers his whole career, this was his big break. But under the professional triumph, a darker thread had unraveled, because while James had been measuring ice melt, he had also been melting in someone else's arms. Chloe, the project's media coordinator, was young, full of fire, with a laugh that made the stress of scientific deadlines blur into late-night drinks. What had started as an innocent toast to success turned into a secret too heavy for James to carry home. And yet, here he was, back in Portland, suitcase in hand, his heart pounding, hoping to slip back into the life he'd left behind. But Emily, his wife of 8 years, the woman who knew him better than anyone, was no fool. The car ride home was suffocating. Emily kept her eyes on the road, both hands clamped tightly on the steering wheel. James, usually a natural storyteller, found himself grasping for words. "I saw a guanaco up close," he blurted out, laughing too loudly. "Kind of like a llama, but wilder. You would have loved it." She smiled, a brief flicker, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sounds amazing," she said softly, her voice flat, almost mechanical. He glanced at her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the faint shadow under her eyes, the small crease between her brows. She had always been an artist, sensitive to details. She painted sunsets as if she could trap the colors of time. She captured people's expressions on canvas so precisely, they sometimes startled even her. And now, she was reading him like one of her own portraits. She saw it. She knew. When they pulled into the driveway, Emily didn't rush out to help with the bags. She walked inside, leaving the door open behind her. James stood there for a moment, the cold air biting his skin. It was as if the house itself hesitated to welcome him back. Inside, the house was perfectly clean. Too clean. The absence of clutter was unsettling, like the place had been waiting, tense and braced, for something to break. James moved through the rooms slowly, dragging his suitcase behind him. In the bedroom, he paused. The bed was neatly made, untouched. On the nightstand sat Emily's journal, closed, a pen resting on top. There had been a time when she left little notes for him, scribbled hearts on napkins, quick sketches on sticky notes. Now there was just silence. Downstairs, he heard her moving in the kitchen, the soft clinking of cups. For a wild moment, he wondered if he should just blurt it out, confess everything. But then fear surged up, drowning the impulse. He was a coward. He knew it. Dinner was brief. She made them pasta, served it without comment, ate in near silence. James filled the space with awkward stories. The stunning mountains, the freezing nights, the thrilling data they'd collected. But Emily only nodded, offered polite smiles, and stared at her plate. When they went to bed, she turned off the light without a word. He lay next to her in the darkness, listening to her steady breathing. His chest felt tight, his mind racing. Could she really know? Had someone told her? Or was it just the invisible weight of guilt, pressing down, shaping every word, every glance? But the hook, the twist that would shock even James, was still waiting. The next morning, as he stood at the sink brushing his teeth, he noticed something strange. Emily's phone, left unlocked on the counter. She never left it like that. Without thinking, his eyes flicked to the screen. A message was open. It wasn't a text. It was a draft email. Unsent. Addressed to Rachel, her best friend. Subject line: I know about Chloe. James's heart stopped. His mouth went dry. The toothbrush slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft clatter in the sink. He wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, a coincidence, some mistake. But as his eyes scanned the lines she'd written, his worst fears came crashing down. Emily knew. She had known even before he got off the plane. And she was waiting. The email was raw, vulnerable, filled with lines like, I can't believe he'd do this after everything we've built. And I'm not sure how to confront him. And I wonder if we've been living two separate lives for longer than I want to admit. James stumbled back, his knees weak. The bathroom mirror reflected a man he barely recognized. Pale, wide-eyed, heart pounding like a war drum. In that instant, all the calculations, all the rehearsed explanations, all the excuses he'd lined, up in his head crumbled. The truth was bare. Emily was no fool, and the confrontation was no longer a matter of if. It was only a matter of when. James walked downstairs where Emily was pouring coffee, humming softly to herself. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, almost too calm. He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand gently. James, she said quietly, I think we should talk tonight. There are things we need to clear up. His mouth went dry. He nodded mutely. And as the clock ticked on through the day, every sound, every glance, every heartbeat felt sharpened by the edge of what was coming. This was no ordinary homecoming. This was the beginning of a reckoning, and neither of them knew how the night would end. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating these powerful, emotional stories, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Now here's a quick question for you to answer in the comments. If you were Emily, what would you do? A. Confront James directly tonight and demand the truth. B. Stay quiet for now and gather more evidence before confronting him. Drop your answer, A or B, in the comments below. We're reading them all, and your thoughts help shape the next parts of the story. Stay tuned for where the cracks beneath the surface widen and secrets come tumbling out. Emily sat in her art studio, a place once filled with joy, now steeped in a heavy, suffocating quiet. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, catching the edges of unfinished canvases, stacks of brushes, and jars of paint water gone murky with neglect. She hadn't painted in weeks, maybe months. What was once her sanctuary, her escape, now felt like a prison. She picked up a brush absent-mindedly, twirling it between her fingers. Her gaze drifted to a framed photo on the shelf. A younger James and Emily, arms wrapped around each other on the Oregon coast, hair tousled by the wind, laughing like the world belonged only to them. Her chest tightened. Since James's return from Patagonia, Emily had been walking through the days like a ghost. She made coffee, went to work, answered emails, smiled politely at colleagues. She went through the motions of being a wife, cooking dinner, folding laundry, asking about his day. But inside, something raw and jagged twisted in her gut. Because she knew. She had known before he stepped off the plane, before he had even packed his bags to come home. It was the small things at first. The change in his voice during their last few video calls, the sudden shift in how often he messaged, the faint but unmistakable distance. And then there was Rachel, her best friend, who worked in the same environmental research circles. One evening, over wine and hushed whispers, Rachel had told her, "There's talk, Em, about James and that media coordinator. Chloe, I think her name is." Emily hadn't wanted to believe it. She had defended James fiercely at first, shaking her head, dismissing the rumors as gossip. But doubt is a slippery thing. Once it sinks its claws into you, it reshapes everything. She began replaying their past few months. The way James had rushed off to the project, how he had seemed almost eager to leave, how his attention in their last phone calls flickered like a faulty light bulb. She tried to brush it off, tried to tell herself she was being paranoid, needy, but late at night, lying awake, staring at the ceiling while James was thousands of miles away, her heart whispered the truth she didn't want to face. Now, with him back home, the evidence was no longer subtle. She saw it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he touched her out of obligation, not desire. She felt it in the unspoken tension hanging between them, thick as fog. She had drafted the email to Rachel a dozen times but never hit send. Writing it made it real. It was easier to pretend, to hold on to the fragile shell of normalcy, but pretending couldn't last forever. Meanwhile, James moved through the house like a man balancing on a tightrope, always one misstep away from crashing down. His guilt gnawed at him, but so did his fear of losing the life he'd built, the woman he had once loved so fiercely, fear of seeing himself for who he had become. He tried to tell himself the affair was a mistake, a slip, a momentary escape. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. It hadn't been a single night or a drunken lapse. It had been choice after choice, each one pulling him further from the man he thought he was. In the days after his return, he noticed Emily's subtle acts of distance. She spent long hours at her studio, came home late, gave vague answers about where she'd been. She locked the bedroom door at night, claiming she was just exhausted. She started attending yoga classes, meditation workshops, things she had never been interested in before. Once, James tried to join her for an evening walk, suggesting they go together like they used to. But Emily smiled faintly and shook her head. "I need the space, James." He watched her walk away, her silhouette retreating down the quiet street, and felt a deep, hollow ache bloom in his chest. In her own world, Emily was quietly building strength. Rachel's friendship became a lifeline, offering not just comfort, but clarity. Over cups of coffee and late-night phone calls, Rachel gently nudged her toward reclaiming her independence. "You're stronger than you think, Em," she said one night. "You don't have to shrink yourself to fit into his mistakes." Emily began to listen. She enrolled in an upcoming women's retreat on the Oregon coast, a weekend designed to help women rediscover their passions, reset their minds, reconnect with themselves. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about survival, about remembering who she was before the betrayals, before the cracks in their marriage. James noticed the change but couldn't name it. All he knew was that the Emily he had left behind was not the Emily who stood before him now. She was quieter, yes, but not defeated. There was a simmering resolve in her, an unspoken strength that unnerved him. One evening, after she had gone to bed, James sat alone in the living room staring at the darkened window. His reflection stared back, hollow-eyed, exhausted. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over Chloe's contact. He hadn't spoken to her since his return. They had exchanged a few terse messages, but nothing more. Ending things had been abrupt, messy, unfinished. A part of him wanted to call, to slip back into the comfort of her voice, the simplicity of their chemistry. But another part of him, the part that still remembered who he wanted to be, knew that was a path he couldn't take again. Instead, he opened a blank note on his phone and began to type. Not to Chloe, not to Emily, but to himself. He poured out everything, the shame, the longing, the regret. It wasn't a confession. It was a reckoning. In the days that followed, the house became a landscape of tension. Small moments crackled with unspoken truths. A look across the dinner table, the brush of hands when passing a dish, a pause at the door before one of them left for the day. And yet, there were flickers of something else, too. Moments when Emily caught herself watching James, wondering if the man she had loved still existed beneath the layers of guilt and lies. Moments when James looked at Emily and felt a surge of longing, not for the passion of the past, but for the simple, fierce honesty they had once shared. But neither of them spoke. Not yet. Emily knew she needed to gather herself before facing what lay ahead. She spent hours in her studio, not painting, just sitting. She thought about the life they had built, the promises they had made, the dreams they had chased together. She thought about the small betrayals that had led them here, not just his, but hers too. The moments she had turned away, the times she had let the distance grow. James, meanwhile, found himself haunted by memories. Of the first time he saw Emily across a crowded room, of the night he proposed under a canopy of stars, of the mornings they spent tangled in bed, whispering about nothing and everything. He wondered when he had started to lose sight of all that. He wondered if it was too late to find his way back. The day Emily left for the retreat, she didn't tell James until the last minute. She packed her bags quietly, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and said, "I need this, James. Please don't call me while I'm gone." James stood in the doorway, watching her drive away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. He wandered through the empty rooms, the ghosts of their life together pressing in from every corner. That night, James sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the blank wall. His phone buzzed once, a message from Chloe. He didn't open it. Instead, he set the phone down, pressed his palms together, and closed his eyes. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that the days ahead would determine everything. He didn't know if Emily would come back. He didn't know if he deserved her forgiveness. But for the first time in a long time, James understood that no matter what happened, the man he had been, the man who had lied, who had cheated, who had run from himself, could not be the man who stood waiting when she returned. He had to change. He had to confront the truth, not just about the affair, but about himself. And that, he realized with a sharp pang, might be the hardest reckoning of all. Emily stood in front of the mirror, the soft light of the early evening brushing over her features. Her reflection stared back, calm on the surface, but inside, her heart raced. She had spent days at the retreat, thinking, meditating, talking to other women who, like her, were balancing on the thin, fraying edge of betrayal and resilience. She had rediscovered her voice there, among strangers who became sudden, fierce allies. And now, standing here, she was ready. When James heard the front door open, he felt his chest tighten. He had spent the past 3 days alone in the house, the silence heavier than he expected. He thought he'd feel relief, maybe even freedom. But what settled over him was something closer to grief. Grief for the man he used to be. Grief for the way Emily used to look at him. Grief for the life he had cracked apart with his own hands. He heard her footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of her bag being set down. His heart pounded. He wanted to speak, to rush to her, to blurt out an apology so raw it would bleed truth. But he stayed frozen on the couch, staring at the wall, every muscle tense. Emily appeared in the doorway. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back loosely, but there was a glow about her, a quiet strength that startled him. She looked at him with eyes that saw straight through, eyes that knew. "We need to talk," she said softly. James nodded, swallowing, hard. He gestured to the couch beside him, but she shook her head and remained standing. "I want you to tell me the truth," Emily said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was even, clear. All of it. James opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. He had rehearsed so many versions of this confession in his mind, but none of them seemed to fit the sharp, quiet moment that had arrived. He began, but Emily lifted a hand gently. "Not the version you think I want to hear," she said. "The real one." James closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling shakily. Then he looked up at her and began. He told her everything about Chloe, the late nights, the dinners that turned into long walks, the shared hotel rooms, about the thrill he had felt, the stupid, selfish rush of being seen as someone exciting, someone still full of promise. He spoke of the moment he crossed the line, the moment he stopped caring about the boundary between flirtation and betrayal. He told her about the guilt that had eaten at him afterward, the excuses he had made, the stories he had told himself, to make it seem less awful than it was. Emily listened without interrupting. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes glistened once or twice, and she blinked them clear. When he finished, the silence that followed felt like a chasm. "I was lonely," James added weakly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I felt like we were drifting apart, and Chloe—" "Stop," Emily said quietly. "Don't put this on me." James felt a flush of shame crawl up his neck. "You're right," he whispered. Emily let out a slow breath, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, she stepped closer, but not to embrace him, to look at him more directly. "I want you to understand something," she said. "This isn't just about Chloe. This isn't about the affair. This is about all the places where you stopped showing up, where you chose to disappear. I can't fix that for you, James. You have to decide if you want to fix it for yourself." Her words struck him like a slap, but not out of cruelty, out of clarity. For a long time they stood there, the air between them charged, heavy. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I'm going to stay at Rachel's for a while," she said. "I need space. I need to figure out if there's anything left here that's worth saving. And you need to figure out who you are without me holding everything together." James's throat tightened. "Emily, please." She gave a small, sad smile. "Don't beg. Not now." She turned and walked down the hallway, gathering a small overnight bag she had packed earlier. James followed her to the door, his heart pounding, words clamoring in his chest, but none of them seemed right. Emily paused at the threshold, turning to look at him one last time. "I loved you," she said softly. "Maybe I still do, in some way. But love isn't enough when trust is gone." Then she slipped out the door, leaving James standing there, hollow, stunned, breathless. The hours that followed passed in a blur. James sat on the floor of the living room, his back against the wall, staring into the dark. He thought about calling Chloe, about drowning his pain in distraction. But when he picked up his phone, his finger hovered over her name, then fell away. He needed to face this, alone. The next morning, James called a therapist. It was a small step, but the hardest one he had taken so far. He knew the road ahead would be long, uncomfortable, filled with truths he hadn't wanted to face. But for the first time in a long time, he understood that change wasn't about fixing his marriage. It was about fixing himself. Meanwhile, Emily sat on Rachel's couch, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea in her hands. Rachel sat beside her, silently, not offering platitudes or advice, just presence. Emily stared out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "I thought I'd feel more angry," Emily murmured. "But mostly I just feel empty." "That's normal," Rachel said gently. "You're grieving. It's not just the betrayal. It's the loss of the life you thought you had." Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "I keep wondering if there was something I could have done. Something I missed." Rachel placed a hand on her arm. "Don't carry his choices, Em. They're not yours to bear." That night, as Emily lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, she let the tears come quietly. Not the wild, gut-wrenching sobs she had imagined, but slow, steady tears that traced the edges of her sorrow. She cried for the years they had, shared, for the moments that would never come back, for the man she had believed in, and the woman she was now learning to be without him. Across the city, James sat in the quiet of their home, his hands trembling as he opened a blank journal. He began to write, not for Emily, not for Chloe, but for himself. He wrote about the small lies that had grown into gulfs, about the insecurities he had buried, about the moments when he had felt invisible and had made himself seen in all the wrong ways. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if Emily would ever come back, if forgiveness was even possible. But he knew that if he didn't face himself now, there would be nothing left to fight for. And so, in two separate corners of the same city, two people began the hardest work of their lives. Not rebuilding a marriage, not healing a broken love, but confronting the deepest, most painful truths of who they were. It was a beginning neither of them had wanted, but it was a beginning nonetheless. Emily walked alone along the Oregon coastline, her boots sinking slightly into the wet sand, the roar of the waves filling the cool evening air. The sky above stretched in layers of gold and gray, the last rays of sunset curling over the horizon. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, feeling the wind thread through her hair. It had been weeks since she left the house she once called home. Weeks of retreat, of solitude, of questioning. And now, here she was, not running away, but walking toward something. Herself. At the women's retreat, Emily had found a quiet place to unpack her heart. She had sat with strangers who, like her, carried stories of betrayal, loss, reinvention. She had painted again, not for galleries, not for commissions, but for herself. Her brushes swept across blank canvases with a freedom she hadn't known in years. She climbed trails she'd never hiked before, stood on rocky cliffs, screamed, into the wind, just to hear her own voice echo back. She remembered who she was before she became a wife, holding up the weight of a crumbling marriage. One night, sitting under the stars with a group of women around a fire, Emily found herself sharing her story. She spoke of James, of the affair, of the slow erosion of trust, and the deeper ache of being unseen. The women listened without judgment. One of them, an older woman named Marla, reached across and squeezed her hand. "You've already survived the worst part," Marla had said gently. "Now comes the part where you decide who you want to be next." Meanwhile, across the city, James was learning the quiet discipline of rebuilding himself. Therapy was not what he expected. It was harder, rawer. He found himself confronting not just the affair, but the deep patterns of self-doubt, insecurity, and avoidance that had shaped him long before he met Emily. In the safety of the therapist's office, he peeled back layers he had buried for years. Why had he needed Chloe's attention to feel alive? Why had he let himself slip away from the man he wanted to be? Why had he been so afraid of honesty? At first, James had thought this work was about winning Emily back, about proving he was worthy of a second chance. But over time, something shifted. He realized he needed to do this work for himself, not as a husband, not as a partner, but as a man. He started volunteering at a local wildlife rehabilitation center, pouring his energy into something bigger than his own pain. He fixed broken fences, cleaned animal enclosures, learned the rhythms of caring for something fragile and wild. In the simple, unglamorous work, he found a strange kind of peace. Days turned into weeks. James and Emily spoke occasionally, mostly by text. Emily kept the conversations brief. She focused on her art, her new routines, her own healing. James respected the space, even when it hurt. He stopped trying to control the outcome. He simply showed up each day, doing the work, not knowing where it would lead. Then came the night of Emily's art exhibition. Rachel had pushed her to submit her work, to step back into the world not as a wife or a betrayed woman, but as an artist with something to say. Emily hesitated at first, but the paintings poured out of her with a force she couldn't deny. On the night of the opening, the small local gallery filled with people, friends, strangers, fellow artists. The walls were lined with Emily's new work, raw, vibrant, unapologetically honest. There were no pretty landscapes, no gentle portraits. Instead, there were bursts of color, jagged lines, broken shapes stitched back together. The theme was clear: resilience. James came quietly, slipping in near the back, unsure if he should even be there. He didn't approach Emily, didn't make his presence known. He just watched from a distance as she stood among her work, her eyes alight, her laughter real. For the first time in a long time, he saw her not as his wife, not as the woman he had hurt, but as a person wholly herself. And it broke something open in him. After the exhibition, they ran into each other outside. Emily stepped into the cool night air, taking a deep breath, and there he was, standing under the streetlight. She paused, surprised, but didn't turn away. "You were incredible tonight," James said softly. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice steady. There was no bitterness, no accusation, just acknowledgement. They stood there for a long, quiet moment. Two people no longer pretending, no longer clinging to the versions of themselves they had outgrown. "I've been working on myself," James said. "Not to win you back. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I needed to face who I've been. I needed to change." Emily studied him, her eyes kind but guarded. "I'm glad, James. Truly." She hesitated, then added, "I don't know where we go from here." "I don't either," James admitted. "But I wanted you to know. I see you. I see who you are, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." That night, they parted ways without promises, without plans. Emily went home with Rachel, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. James walked home alone, feeling the same. In the days that followed, they continued their separate journeys. Emily booked a solo trip to Italy, something she had dreamed of for years but never dared to do. She wanted to wander old streets, visit art museums, sit in quiet cafes and sketch. She wanted to taste freedom on her tongue, to prove to herself that she was whole, with or without anyone beside her. James stayed in Portland, continuing his volunteer work, his therapy, his slow process of rebuilding. He joined a men's accountability group, where he shared his story with strangers who, like him, were trying to become better. He learned to sit with discomfort, to apologize without expecting forgiveness, to face his own shadows. Months passed. When Emily returned from Italy, she felt transformed. She had laughed in the sun, gotten lost in winding streets, filled sketchbooks with new ideas. She had remembered what it was like to belong only to herself. One evening, at a charity gala for environmental causes, their paths crossed again. Emily, radiant in a simple dress, mingling among artists and donors. James, dressed simply, standing near the back, talking quietly with a group of volunteers. Their eyes met across the room. This time, there was no rush, no desperation. They walked toward each other slowly, smiling, not as ex-spouses clinging to the past, not as wounded people seeking repair, but as two individuals who had walked through fire and emerged different. "Hello, James," Emily said. "Hello, Emily." They talked softly, sharing stories, not of pain, not of blame, but of what they had learned. Emily spoke of Italy, of the joy of rediscovery. James spoke of his work, the animals he cared for, the man he was trying to become. As the night drew on, they stood together on the edge of the dance floor, watching couples sway to slow music. Neither reached for the other. Neither made promises. But in the quiet between them, there was something new. Not a reunion, not a romantic spark, but a mutual recognition. They had let go. They had survived. And now, whatever came next would be built not on old patterns or desperate repairs, but on the truth of who they were, separately and fully. The morning light poured softly through Emily's window as she sat cross-legged on her bed, a steaming mug of coffee cradled between her hands. Her suitcase, still half-packed from the Italy trip, lay open on the floor, the edges of her sketchbooks, poking out from under folded clothes. She let her fingers trace the rim of the cup, feeling the quiet hum of life settling around her again. The trip had given her a new kind of clarity, a sense that she belonged not to anyone else, not even to the version of herself she once was, but to her own unfolding story. In the weeks since she'd returned to Portland, Emily had thrown herself back into her art. Not to escape, but to express. Her new series was bolder, freer, exploring not just heartbreak and betrayal, but resilience, identity, possibility. She no longer painted to process the past. She painted to shape her future. James, meanwhile, continued the steady, humble work he'd started. The therapy sessions hadn't stopped just because time had passed. If anything, they had deepened. He attended his men's group regularly, learning to listen, to confront himself, to untangle the roots of the choices that had once destroyed everything he loved. The Wildlife Center became his second home, a place where his hands were always busy, where his mind could find moments of peace as he tended to creatures more fragile than himself. He no longer measured his days by whether Emily might return. He measured them by whether he was becoming a man he could respect. And yet, a quiet space inside him still held her, not as a possession, not as a goal, but as a presence that had helped shape his growth. It was late spring when they saw each other again. The charity gala had come and gone, but tonight, James and Emily both found themselves at a small community event, a fundraiser for local environmental projects. Neither of them knew the other would be there, but when their eyes met across the room, there was no jolt, no awkwardness, only a gentle recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had each traveled. Emily approached first, her smile calm, genuine. "Hi, James." He smiled softly. "Hi, Emily." They stood together, watching a group of volunteers set up auction items. For a long moment, they didn't speak. There was no need to fill the silence with small talk. The air between them was no longer charged with tension or regret. It was simply still. "How have you been?" Emily asked at last. "Good," James said, and he meant it. "It's been a lot of hard work, but good." Emily nodded. "Me too." They walked together toward the back of the room, where the noise thinned out. There, under the soft glow of string lights, they settled onto a bench. They spoke quietly, sharing small moments from their lives. The trip to Italy, the gallery shows, the wildlife rescues, the workshops. They didn't speak of the affair, of the past hurts, of the shattered pieces. They spoke of now. For the first time, James allowed himself to look at Emily not as the woman he had lost, but as the woman she had become. And Emily saw James not as the man who had betrayed her, but as the man who had grown beyond his worst mistakes. They were no longer defined by their past roles. They were two individuals, whole on their own. "Do you ever think about us?" James asked quietly, his voice almost hesitant. Emily let the question sit for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way I used to. I don't think about what we were. I think about what we both learned, what we both became because of everything that happened." James let out a slow breath. "I used to think the goal was to win you back. But now, I don't know. I think the goal was to find myself, whether or not you're part of my life." Emily smiled softly, her eyes glinting with something like admiration. "I'm glad you see that." They sat in the stillness, the hum of the event fading into the background. "I'm not sure what comes next," James said after a while. "Neither am I," Emily said, "and maybe that's okay." They didn't make promises. They didn't declare intentions. They simply shared a quiet understanding that life was no longer about rushing to fill the empty spaces or repairing what was broken just for the sake of old labels. Life was about stepping forward, honestly, carefully, wherever that might lead. In the weeks that followed, Emily continued to flourish in her work, exploring projects that took her into new circles, new collaborations. She signed up to lead a creative workshop for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, channeling her own journey into something that might help others. She laughed more freely, traveled more boldly, and savored the fact that her life belonged fully to her. James expanded his volunteer work, took on more responsibility, even began mentoring younger volunteers. He found strength in being useful, in giving back, in staying grounded. His relationship with Emily shifted into something rare and beautiful, not romantic, not dependent, but deeply respectful. There were moments, of course, when they missed what they had once shared. Moments when a song, a memory, a glance caught them off guard. But neither was bound by those moments. They had learned that love, in its healthiest form, is not about possession or repair. It is about freedom. One summer evening, they crossed paths at a neighborhood gathering, a small outdoor concert in the park. They shared a drink, laughed about old memories, watched the sunset settle over the treetops. As they parted ways, Emily touched James's arm gently. "You know," she said softly, "I'm proud of us." James smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. "Me too." They walked away in opposite directions, not because they were turning their backs on each other, but because they each had paths to walk that were their own. And that, in the end, was the quiet victory of their story. It was not about mending the past to make it look untouched. It was about carrying the scars with grace, building something honest from the pieces, and knowing when to let go, not out of anger, not out of failure, but out of love. The story of James and Emily is a layered, deeply emotional journey of love, betrayal, loss, and ultimately, self-discovery. At its heart, it is not just the story of a broken marriage, but a mirror reflecting the raw truths many people face when life does not unfold the way they imagined. James, a man once defined by his ambition and the outward success of his career, made choices that shattered the trust in his marriage. His affair with Chloe was not just about desire or excitement, it was about escaping the growing distance within himself, a distance he had failed to acknowledge until it was too late. When Emily discovered the betrayal, she did not immediately lash out or crumble. Instead, she chose a quiet, resolute path. She stepped away, not to punish James, but to protect her own heart and rediscover the woman she had set aside for too long. For Emily, the journey was one of reclamation. Through her art, travel, and the support of close friends, she slowly peeled back the layers of grief and rediscovered a version of herself that existed before she became the wife. Italy, the retreat, the long hours in her studio, all became tools for healing, not by erasing the past, but by integrating its lessons. For James, the journey was one of deep self-confrontation. Therapy, volunteer work, accountability groups, these were not quick fixes, and they were not romantic gestures aimed at winning Emily back. They were the painstaking efforts of a man realizing that true change does not happen when you're trying to impress or repair. True change happens when you sit, alone, in the discomfort of your own failures, and choose to face them honestly. By the time they crossed paths again, both had grown in ways they could never have imagined at the start of their separation, and that was the profound truth of their story. Reconciliation did not mean returning to the old relationship. It meant honoring who they had become, separately, and choosing to carry forward not out of need, but out of respect. In the end, James and Emily showed that some relationships are not meant to be saved in their old form. Sometimes, love transforms into something else. Not romantic, not possessive, but respectful and free. They learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting, nor is it about erasing pain. It's about releasing the need to control or rewrite the past and allowing both people to walk their own paths with dignity. The deeper lesson here for all of us is this: growth after heartbreak is not about fixing what broke, but about rebuilding yourself from the inside out. It's about learning to sit with uncomfortable truths, to take ownership of your choices, and to redefine your identity outside of the roles you once held. Healing does not require another person to complete you. It requires you to become whole on your own. In today's world, where relationships are often rushed, where apologies are shallow, and where true accountability is rare, the story of James and Emily invites us to reflect on the importance of genuine growth. It reminds us that facing failure head-on, without shortcuts or quick fixes, is where real transformation begins. For anyone listening who has been betrayed, or who has betrayed someone they love, the question is not simply, will we get back together? The real question is, who will I choose to become after this? Will you let the pain define you, or will you let it shape you into a stronger, wiser, more honest version of yourself? Whether you're healing from heartbreak, facing difficult truths in your own life, or standing at a crossroads, the lessons here apply. Take time for deep reflection. Seek help when you need it. Surround yourself with people who hold you accountable. And most importantly, remember that your worth is not defined by someone else's love or approval. You are whole, even when life's sharpest blows try to convince you otherwise. Now, here's a small interactive question for you. If you were in Emily's shoes, after all the growth, self-discovery, and healing, would you A. choose to cautiously rebuild a new relationship with James, honoring the growth you both achieved? B. choose to walk forward separately, carrying the respect but not returning to the old relationship? Comment your answer, A or B, below. We're excited to see how you would navigate this moment, and your thoughts help inspire others who may be reading. Also, what are your opinions or insights after hearing this story? What lessons did you take away? What would you have done differently if you were James or Emily? Please share your ideas and reflections in the comments so we can all learn from each other's perspectives. If you enjoyed this story and want to support more powerful, emotional content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating thoughtful stories that connect deeply with our audience. Thank you for being here, and we can't wait to share more with you next time.